Biography: Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's photographer and the propaganda machine of Nazi Germany. Heinrich Hoffmann was more than just a photographer. He was the man who crafted the face of Adolf Hitler for the German public. Born in 1885 in the Bavarian town of Fürth, Hoffmann rose from modest beginnings to become the official photographer of the Nazi Party. His lens helped build a myth around Hitler, portraying him as a heroic, almost divine figure. Hoffmann's images were printed in millions of propaganda posters, newspapers, and photo books, shaping public perception throughout the Third Reich. But his role went far beyond photography. He was a trusted member of Hitler's inner circle, a cultural gatekeeper, and a profiteer of looted art. This is the gripping story of how one man's camera helped fuel one of history's darkest regimes. Did Heinrich Hoffmann truly believe in Hitler's ideology, or was he simply using the regime to gain power and wealth? 1. Early years in Fürth, 1885 to 1903. Heinrich Hoffmann was born on September 12, 1885, in the town of Fürth, located in the Kingdom of Bavaria, which was then part of the German Empire. Fürth, neighboring the larger city of Nuremberg, was a growing industrial town in the late 19th century, blending the traditions of Bavarian culture with the economic ambitions of a modernizing Germany. It was in this environment of transition that Heinrich came into the world, the only child of Karl Hoffmann and his wife, Marie. His father, Karl, was a professional photographer and owned a modest photographic studio in the town center. In a time when photography was evolving from novelty to profession, Karl Hoffmann managed to establish himself among the town's middle class, photographing weddings, local notables, and commercial events. Marie, his mother, was a quiet but firm woman who managed the household with strict discipline and strong moral values. Together, they raised Heinrich in a conservative, Protestant environment rooted in traditional German values: respect for authority, pride in the nation, and an emphasis on hard work. Growing up, Heinrich spent many hours in his father's studio, watching the careful arrangement of subjects, the flash of magnesium light, and the slow chemical process of developing images in the darkroom. These experiences left an impression on the young boy. While many children of his age were playing in the streets or helping with farm chores, Heinrich was learning about lighting, focus, and perspective. His father allowed him to assist with small tasks, like setting up backdrops or cleaning lenses, and by his early teens, he was already familiar with the technical workings of the camera. Outside the studio, Heinrich attended a local gymnasium, a rigorous secondary school that offered a classical education. He was an average student, not particularly drawn to Latin or mathematics, but he displayed talent in drawing and visual composition. His teachers noted his attention to detail and creative curiosity, though he remained quiet and socially reserved. He didn't show much interest in politics or literature during this stage of life, preferring visual storytelling over academic debate. By the turn of the 20th century, Germany was a rapidly industrializing power, and the arts were undergoing dramatic change. Young men with technical skills and artistic inclinations, like Heinrich, were beginning to explore photography as more than a family trade. It was becoming a new form of communication and documentation. Inspired by his father's guidance and his own ambitions, Heinrich decided to pursue photography professionally. In 1903, at the age of 18, he made the decision to leave Fürth and seek an apprenticeship abroad, setting the stage for his first major journey to London, the heart of the British Empire and a growing center of photographic innovation. 2. Photographic apprenticeship and early career, 1903 to 1911. In 1903, Heinrich Hoffmann left Germany and moved to London, where he began his photographic apprenticeship. At the time, London was not only the political capital of the British Empire but also one of the most dynamic cultural cities in the world. The city's vibrant mix of royal tradition, urban poverty, and industrial progress provided young photographers with endless subjects. For Hoffmann, it was a chance to move beyond his father's studio and learn photography in a cosmopolitan setting. He began working for a series of commercial studios and eventually apprenticed with the renowned German-British photographer Emil Otto Hopper, who was quickly becoming one of the most famous portraitists in Europe. Hopper's refined style and mastery of composition left a lasting impression on Hoffmann. Under his mentorship, Hoffmann learned to treat photography as both a business and an art. He studied lighting techniques, formal portraiture, and the art of visual storytelling. London taught him how to capture not only faces but atmospheres. He began to understand the subtle power of imagery, not just to reflect reality, but to shape it. Hoffmann was also exposed to the competitive world of photographic publishing, including illustrated newspapers and early press photography. It was here that he first encountered the idea of photography as a tool of mass communication, a way to influence public opinion. This would become one of the defining themes of his later career. By 1909, after 6 years in London, Hoffmann returned to Germany. He settled in Munich, a city rich in artistic culture and growing nationalist sentiment. Munich at the time was home to a mix of traditional Bavarian life, bohemian art circles, and the early rumblings of political extremism. The tension between modernity and tradition shaped much of its public discourse, and this backdrop appealed to Hoffmann's sense of visual drama. He took additional training at photographic studios in Munich and began working for news agencies that were experimenting with photojournalism. He captured street scenes, public events, and parades, and sold his photographs to newspapers and magazines. His early images from this period, ordinary people at work, local politicians speaking, and street processions, demonstrate a growing talent for framing subjects with clarity and intention. He wasn't just taking pictures, he was crafting narratives. In 1911, with some savings and a growing portfolio, Hoffmann opened his own photographic studio in Munich. It was a modest enterprise, but his work quickly attracted attention from local elites and cultural figures. He offered traditional portraits but also specialized in photo sequences for illustrated journals. His reputation grew steadily, and he was known for his ability to stage photographs that felt spontaneous and full of life. As his professional independence grew, so did his ambitions. Hoffmann began to sense that photography could be more than art or business. It could be a gateway into politics, culture, and power. The studio became more than just a business. It was a stage where he could direct the public image of others. His next step would be shaped not just by art, but by war. 3. World War I and the rise of a political eye, 1914 to 1918. When World War I erupted in the summer of 1914, Heinrich Hoffmann, like many Germans of his generation, answered the call to serve. At 29 years old, he was no longer a young apprentice but a trained photographer with a growing career. Rather than join as a combat soldier, he was recruited to serve as a war photographer within the German army. The war would profoundly shape his worldview, his technical skills, and ultimately, his political trajectory. Photography during World War I was a complex endeavor. Military authorities tightly controlled what could be photographed and published. While cameras were increasingly portable, photographers still had to carry heavy equipment, manage exposure times in difficult conditions, and process images in the field. Despite these limitations, war photography played a crucial role in documenting the front lines and shaping public perception of the conflict. Hoffmann was assigned to several locations along the Western Front. He traveled with infantry units, capturing images of trenches, destroyed villages, military hospitals, and supply caravans. Unlike modern combat photographers who often work at great personal risk, Hoffmann's assignments were sometimes more controlled and focused on morale-boosting or strategic documentation. Still, the horrors of war were unavoidable. Shell craters, amputees, and the haunted faces of soldiers became part of his visual language. One of Hoffmann's primary roles was to produce photographs for military reports, propaganda leaflets, and internal documentation. His images helped construct a narrative of German heroism, sacrifice, and determination. But behind the lens, Hoffmann saw the physical and emotional cost of the war. He became increasingly convinced of Germany's cultural and political importance in Europe, and of the dangers posed by instability and weakness. His nationalism, always present, began to harden into something more ideological. The war also expanded Hoffmann's understanding of the power of the image. He saw how certain photographs could stir emotion, strengthen political resolve, or inspire hatred. He studied how the Allies used photography to demonize the German soldier, and how German images tried to counteract that narrative. This growing awareness of media manipulation would later form the foundation of his career in Nazi propaganda. By the war's end in 1918, Germany was exhausted. Millions were dead, the economy was in ruins, and the monarchy had fallen. Hoffmann returned to Munich with a sense of betrayal. Like many veterans, he believed the German military had not truly been defeated on the battlefield but had been undermined by political weakness at home. The idea of the stab in the back, a myth that claimed civilian leaders and Jews had betrayed the German army, was circulating widely, and Hoffmann was susceptible to such thinking. Back in civilian life, Hoffmann reopened his studio and began reviewing his war negatives. Some he published, others he stored away. But the war had changed him. He was no longer just a craftsman of the camera. He had become a man with a political eye. In a nation simmering with anger, economic turmoil, and ideological battles, Hoffmann was about to find himself drawn into a new kind of conflict, one fought with images, symbols, and spectacle. 4. Post-war Munich and the birth of political photography, 1919 to 1923. The end of World War I brought Germany to its knees, and nowhere was the political chaos more visible than in Munich. The city, once a hub of conservative Catholic tradition and cultural refinement, became a breeding ground for radicalism. The Bavarian monarchy had collapsed, and short-lived socialist governments briefly seized power, only to be crushed by nationalist militias. In this volatile atmosphere, Heinrich Hoffmann found both danger and opportunity. Returning to Munich in 1919, Hoffmann resumed his work as a photographer, but the market had changed. Weddings and family portraits were no longer his primary business. Instead, he turned his lens to the streets, documenting rallies, protests, and political gatherings. He photographed monarchists, communists, and Free Corps paramilitaries alike. His studio, once a neutral space for art, became increasingly involved in the turbulent political life of the city. Hoffmann was personally drawn to nationalist movements. Like many veterans of the war, he saw Germany's defeat not as a military loss, but as a moral and political collapse. He sympathized with those who blamed the Treaty of Versailles for Germany's suffering and believed the Weimar Republic was too weak to restore national pride. His photography reflected this shift. He focused more on nationalist events, capturing dramatic moments of flags raised, fists clenched, and speeches made in beer halls and public squares. It was during this period that Hoffmann began covering the rallies of a small but growing political group, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP. Initially just another radical faction among dozens, the group stood out for its theatricality and charismatic speaker, Adolf Hitler. Hoffmann's first photographs of Hitler date to around 1920. They show a man with intense eyes, sharp gestures, and a commanding presence. Hoffmann recognized something different in him. Unlike other politicians, Hitler seemed to understand the power of the visual moment. Their first encounter was professional. Hoffmann was simply covering an event, but it quickly grew into something more. Hitler appreciated Hoffmann's ability to frame him as a heroic figure. He understood that images could reach people faster and more deeply than words. For Hoffmann, photographing Hitler was not just another job. He saw a potential client who could go far, and who, if supported correctly, might change Germany. As the NSDAP grew, so did Hoffmann's role. He became the unofficial chronicler of the movement, capturing photographs of party meetings, marches, and key figures. His photos were printed in nationalist newspapers and handed out as postcards. He experimented with angles and lighting that emphasized Hitler's strength and passion. It was a calculated effort to build a public image that would resonate with disillusioned Germans looking for leadership. The culmination of this early phase came in November 1923 with the Beer Hall Putsch. Hitler and his followers attempted to overthrow the Bavarian government by force, marching through the streets of Munich in a failed coup. Hoffmann was there, camera in hand. Although the putsch collapsed and Hitler was arrested, Hoffmann's photographs of the event circulated among sympathizers, transforming a defeat into a visual legend. After the putsch, Hoffmann's association with Hitler became known to authorities, and he faced scrutiny. Still, he avoided prosecution and continued working quietly, waiting for the political climate to shift. The events of 1919 to 1923 had taught him a powerful lesson. In the age of mass politics, images could be as revolutionary as bullets. 5. Becoming Hitler's personal photographer, 1923 to 1932. Following the failed Beer Hall Putsch in 1923, Adolf Hitler was imprisoned for high treason. For most political figures, this would have been the end. But for Hitler, prison became a launching pad. During his incarceration at Landsberg prison, he wrote Mein Kampf and began carefully planning his return to politics. Outside the prison walls, Heinrich Hoffmann maintained his loyalty. He kept the photographic archive of the NSDAP alive, protected images from seizure, and prepared for the day when Hitler would return to public life. When Hitler was released from prison in late 1924, he re-entered a changed political environment. The Nazi Party had been banned temporarily, and Germany was experiencing a period of economic stabilization. Yet the undercurrents of resentment remained. Hoffmann immediately resumed photographing Hitler and played a key role in rebuilding the Führer's image. It was during this period that their personal relationship deepened. Hoffmann was no longer just a press photographer covering a politician, he became Hitler's trusted visual architect. In 1927, Hitler granted Hoffmann exclusive rights to photograph him. This move was unprecedented. Politicians typically allowed multiple media outlets to cover their events, but Hitler understood the power of controlling his image. Hoffmann's camera became the only authorized lens through which the public could view the Nazi leader. The photographs were carefully curated to depict Hitler not as a politician but as a messianic figure, strong, visionary, and above ordinary men. Hoffmann developed a strict visual code for portraying Hitler. He avoided candid shots, preferring staged compositions. He emphasized angles that showed Hitler speaking to crowds, staring into the distance, or clasping his hands as if in prayer. Every image was meant to convey power, sincerity, and destiny. The two men worked in tandem. Hitler often posed with deliberate gestures, and Hoffmann captured the moment that best suited the myth they were creating. To expand the impact of these images, Hoffmann established a photo publishing business. He printed thousands of postcards, posters, and photo albums featuring Hitler and other Nazi leaders. These were sold across Germany and helped spread the party's message far beyond Munich. Hoffmann's photos appeared in nationalist newspapers and party journals. The imagery was consistent, repetitive, and iconic, turning Hitler into a brand. Beyond his work behind the camera, Hoffmann began playing a broader role in the Nazi movement. His Munich studio became a political hub, visited by SA men, propagandists, and party organizers. It was also here that Hoffmann introduced Eva Braun, one of his studio assistants, to Hitler in 1929. The two would later begin a secret relationship that lasted until the end of the war. In many ways, Hoffmann's personal and professional lives became deeply intertwined with the Nazi apparatus. By 1930, with Germany entering a new phase of political and economic crisis, the Nazi Party surged in popularity. Hitler's public appearances became larger and more theatrical, and Hoffmann documented every step. From massive rallies to intimate meetings, his camera was always present. In 1932, Hitler ran for president against Paul von Hindenburg. Though he lost the election, he gained national prominence, and again, Hoffmann's imagery played a vital role. The carefully crafted photographs were used in campaign posters, pamphlets, and press kits, presenting Hitler as Germany's only hope. By the time Hitler was appointed Chancellor in January 1933, Hoffmann was not just a photographer, he was the visual engineer of the Nazi movement. His images had helped elevate Hitler from a regional agitator to a national leader. And with the Nazi Party now in power, Hoffmann stood on the edge of immense influence and wealth. 6. Power and privilege in the Third Reich, 1933 to 1939. When Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany on January 30, 1933, Heinrich Hoffmann's career entered a new era. No longer confined to documenting rallies or printing propaganda postcards, he now held the keys to the visual identity of the most powerful man in Germany. With the Nazi Party in control of the state, Hoffmann was named the official photographer of the regime, a position that came with unparalleled access and enormous influence. His studio in Munich expanded rapidly. It became more than just a photography business, it evolved into a propaganda factory. Teams of staff processed negatives, retouched images, and published photo books, many of which were authored by Hoffmann and centered around Hitler's life and leadership. One of the most influential titles was The Hitler Nobody Knows, published in 1933. The book presented a curated image of the dictator as a man of the people, humble, devout, and self-disciplined. It sold over 420,000 copies and played a significant role in softening Hitler's public persona among skeptical Germans. Hoffmann was given exclusive control over the commercial distribution of Hitler's image. This monopoly allowed him to license photographs for newspapers, magazines, and posters, charging fees that generated enormous profits. As millions of Germans hung portraits of Hitler in their homes, schools, and businesses, Hoffmann received a cut of nearly every printed image. His wealth grew rapidly, and so did his political clout. As the Nazi state tightened control over German society, Hoffmann's work moved beyond just photographing Hitler. He began documenting the regime's events, massive rallies in Nuremberg, visits from foreign dignitaries, and ceremonial military parades. His lens captured the grandeur of Nazi spectacle, huge columns of marching soldiers, glowing swastika banners under floodlights, and the orchestrated adoration of the masses. These images were not just for domestic consumption. They were also sent abroad to portray a strong and united Germany under Hitler's rule. Hoffmann's influence extended into cultural policy. In 1933, as the regime began purging so-called degenerate art, modern, Jewish, and abstract works that the Nazis deemed subversive, Hoffmann took an active role. He sat on committees that evaluated art collections and advised on acquisitions for state-approved museums. This gave him an opportunity to enrich himself further. As art dealers fled Germany or were forced to sell their works, Hoffmann acquired valuable paintings at heavily discounted prices. Some he kept, others he sold for profit. He developed a reputation as both a ruthless businessman and a tastemaker within the Nazi elite. By the late 1930s, Hoffmann had become one of the most powerful civilians in the Third Reich. He had the ear of the Führer, significant control over visual propaganda, and access to the Nazi Party's cultural machinery. He used this position not only to shape the image of the regime but also to protect his interests. He was known for his jealousy of rival photographers and his ability to shut down competition by leveraging his connection to Hitler. Despite his deep involvement with the regime, Hoffmann maintained an appearance of being apolitical. He rarely spoke at public events or made ideological declarations. Instead, he framed himself as an artist serving the needs of the state. But behind the scenes, he was deeply enmeshed in the mechanisms of power. He facilitated introductions, controlled access to Hitler, and helped shape the aesthetic of National Socialism, from photography to art to architecture. By 1939, on the eve of World War II, Hoffmann was no longer merely the man behind the camera. He was a wealthy, influential figure at the center of the Nazi propaganda machine. His photographs had helped mythologize Hitler. His eye for composition had given the Third Reich its signature imagery. And as Europe descended into conflict, Hoffmann prepared to once again document history, this time not in the trenches, but in the gilded halls and blood-stained battlegrounds of war. 7. War, Propaganda, and Inner Circle Ties, 1939 to 1944. With the outbreak of World War II in September 1939, Heinrich Hoffmann's role as the visual architect of the Third Reich became even more critical. The Nazi regime entered a new phase, one of conquest, repression, and global attention, and Hoffmann's photographs were central to shaping how the German public and international audiences perceived the war. From the first invasions of Poland to the campaigns across Western Europe, his lens remained focused on glorifying Hitler's leadership and the might of the German military. Hoffmann continued to maintain exclusive rights to photograph Adolf Hitler, and his access remained unmatched. While Hitler grew increasingly isolated and mistrustful of outsiders, Hoffmann was one of the few civilians granted regular access to the Führer's inner circle. He accompanied Hitler to military briefings, public speeches, and even private retreats like the Berghof in the Bavarian Alps. At the Berghof, Hoffmann captured informal images of Hitler walking with his dog, speaking with children, or gazing into the mountains, images designed to humanize a man orchestrating the deadliest war in human history. Hoffmann also produced wartime photo books that celebrated German victories. Titles such as Hitler in Poland and the Victory in the West featured carefully selected and captioned images that portrayed the Wehrmacht as disciplined and righteous. Civilian destruction, military failures, and atrocities were never shown. The goal was clear: preserve morale at home and present the regime as a force of order, not terror. Throughout these years, Hoffmann's studio in Munich operated at full capacity. Staff edited and distributed thousands of images weekly to the Nazi press and foreign correspondents. Hoffmann worked closely with Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda, but he maintained a distinct role. While Goebbels controlled written narratives and broadcast media, Hoffmann controlled the regime's visual presentation. His imagery carried the weight of truth, even when it was carefully manipulated. Another crucial aspect of Hoffmann's influence during the war was his continued relationship with Eva Braun. Having introduced her to Hitler years earlier, Hoffmann watched as their secret relationship developed behind closed doors. Eva had been one of Hoffmann's studio assistants, and her early interactions with Hitler were often facilitated through social events organized by Hoffmann. Though she lived largely in seclusion, Eva remained close to Hoffmann and occasionally accompanied him on trips to Berchtesgaden or Berlin. This connection gave Hoffmann a rare position at the intersection of Hitler's personal and political worlds. Few people could move so freely between the propaganda apparatus and the private life of the Führer. It also meant Hoffmann was trusted not only to document public triumphs but also to conceal private vulnerabilities. He knew what to photograph and what to leave out. As the war dragged on and Germany began to suffer setbacks, Hoffmann's role shifted subtly. He continued to produce official imagery, but the mood of the photos darkened. There were fewer smiling soldiers and more images of determination under duress. Hoffmann worked to maintain the illusion of control, even as Allied forces advanced and German cities burned. He also doubled down on his art acquisitions, exploiting the chaos of wartime Europe to obtain valuable works from occupied countries and persecuted collectors. Some pieces were taken under duress, others through formal but fraudulent transactions. By 1944, with Germany's defeat looming, Hoffmann remained firmly within Hitler's inner circle. He had enriched himself through the regime's cultural plunder and retained influence over how the public saw their leader and the war. Yet beneath the polished images and curated albums, the reality of collapse was becoming impossible to hide. Bombs fell on German cities, soldiers died in distant fields, and the Nazi dream dissolved in fire. Still, Hoffmann held his camera steady, capturing the final chapter of the empire he had helped visualize. When the war finally reached its end, the photographs would remain, evidence of power, spectacle, and complicity. 8. Fall of the Reich and arrest, 1945 to 1946. As Allied forces closed in on Berlin and the Nazi regime crumbled in early 1945, Heinrich Hoffmann remained near the center of Hitler's collapsing world. Despite the widespread devastation, he continued photographing what he could: shattered cityscapes, empty ceremonies, and final desperate gestures by a government that had lost control. By now, many top Nazi officials were either dead, in hiding, or planning their escape. Hoffmann, ever a civilian figure in a regime of soldiers and ideologues, was preparing for his own reckoning. In April 1945, Hitler committed suicide in his underground bunker in Berlin. News of the Führer's death sent shockwaves across Germany. Hoffmann, who had not been in Berlin at the time, fled Munich and was captured shortly thereafter by American forces. As one of the most prominent figures in Nazi propaganda, he was quickly identified and taken into custody by US military intelligence. The Americans, who understood the power of imagery, were particularly interested in the vast archive of photographs Hoffmann had accumulated over the years. Upon his arrest, Hoffmann's photographic collection was seized: thousands of negatives, prints, and albums chronicling the rise and fall of the Third Reich. These images were not just propaganda tools, they were historical evidence. Many would later be used in war crimes investigations, denazification proceedings, and post-war media coverage of the Nazi era. For the first time, Hoffmann's carefully curated myth of Hitler was examined by the world without the filters of censorship or control. Hoffmann was interrogated at length by Allied officers. He was asked about his relationship with Hitler, his involvement in the Nazi Party, and his role in producing propaganda. He insisted that he had simply been a photographer, a businessman serving the needs of the state. He denied participating in policymaking or ideological enforcement. To many investigators, Hoffmann appeared more opportunist than ideologue, a man who had capitalized on proximity to power rather than driven by political conviction. Although he was not charged with crimes against humanity or war crimes, Hoffmann's role in the Nazi regime was too central to ignore. He was called as a witness during the Nuremberg trials, where he testified about Hitler's personal life and the inner workings of the regime. His testimony was both valuable and self-serving. He attempted to distance himself from the worst atrocities of the Third Reich while defending his professional conduct. In doing so, he painted himself as an artist caught in a political storm. Nevertheless, Hoffmann faced consequences. In the denazification courts set up by the Allies and German authorities, he was classified as a Belastet, a major offender. This placed him in one of the highest categories of Nazi collaborators. The court found him guilty of profiteering, advancing Nazi ideology through visual propaganda, and financially benefiting from art looting. He was sentenced to 4 years in a labor camp, a punishment later reduced through appeals and legal maneuvering. During his imprisonment, Hoffmann remained defiant. He never fully acknowledged the moral dimensions of his work, nor did he express deep regret for the role he played in supporting one of history's most destructive regimes. Instead, he emphasized the technical quality of his photographs and his professional achievements. He maintained that he had only ever been a photographer, that his camera had documented, not shaped, the horrors of the era. By 1946, Hoffmann had gone from being one of the most powerful civilians in Nazi Germany to a prisoner facing an uncertain future. His career, fortune, and reputation lay in ruins. The man who had once shaped the visual mythology of the Third Reich was now himself a symbol of complicity, of propaganda, and of the blurred line between image-making and power. 9. Post-war life and final years, 1946 to 1957. After serving a portion of his sentence in a labor detention facility as part of the post-war denazification process, Heinrich Hoffmann was released in the early 1950s. His health had declined during his imprisonment, and he returned to a very different Germany from the one he had helped portray in his photographs. The Third Reich was gone, its leaders executed or imprisoned, its cities bombed, and its ideology discredited. Yet Hoffmann re-entered civilian life with a singular focus, reclaiming what he believed was rightfully his. His first effort was to regain ownership of his photographic archives, which had been seized by the Allies. These archives were vast and included not only pictures of Hitler but also thousands of images documenting Nazi events, propaganda campaigns, and official portraits. The US Army had retained many of them for use in war crimes investigations and public education. Hoffmann, however, argued that the photographs were personal property and not subject to confiscation. He began a lengthy legal battle, first with the occupying Allied authorities and later with the new West German government, to recover his negatives and prints. At the same time, Hoffmann sought to reclaim artworks that had been confiscated or identified as part of Nazi looting. His wartime art collection had included numerous paintings and sculptures acquired through official and unofficial channels, some from Jewish owners under duress, others from occupied territories. Though Hoffmann insisted that he had acted in good faith and paid fair prices, post-war investigators uncovered evidence that at least part of his collection had been obtained through coercion or exploitation. Legal claims from families and international restitution commissions complicated his efforts, and several works were ultimately returned to their original owners or placed in state custody. Hoffmann also faced financial hardship. Much of his wartime wealth had been lost in the destruction of the war or frozen by post-war authorities. His photography business was effectively dismantled, and he was no longer permitted to operate as a public figure. In the early years after his release, he lived quietly in Munich, depending on what remained of his savings and assets. He occasionally gave interviews or issued public statements defending his role during the Nazi era. He continued to argue that he had been a neutral observer, a professional photographer swept along by the tides of history. Despite his attempts to rehabilitate his image, Hoffmann remained a deeply controversial figure. In West Germany's emerging culture of historical reckoning, he symbolized the civilian collaborators whose contributions to the regime were less visible than those of uniformed officers, but no less significant. His photographs were still widely circulated, now in history textbooks, documentaries, and court archives. They served as visual records of the regime's rise and fall, and of Hoffmann's unique access to power. In his final years, Hoffmann lived in relative seclusion. He no longer attended political events, gave up efforts to revive his publishing ventures, and focused instead on defending his legacy in writing. He worked on memoirs and legal defenses, though most remained unpublished. Friends and former associates visited him occasionally, but the post-war generation largely viewed him with suspicion or indifference. Heinrich Hoffmann died in Munich on December 15, 1957, at the age of 72. He was buried in a local cemetery with little public attention. In the years that followed, his name remained a footnote in the broader story of Nazi Germany, overshadowed by figures like Goebbels and Himmler, but never forgotten by historians and researchers of propaganda and media. Hoffmann's legacy is still debated. His photographs shaped one of the most powerful visual propaganda campaigns of the 20th century. Through his lens, a dictator was transformed into a savior, and a political movement into a national myth. In doing so, Hoffmann blurred the line between art and power, image and ideology. His work stands as a reminder of how photography, far from being a neutral medium, can be used to build, sustain, and sanctify tyranny. If you've watched this far, it means you enjoy our videos, so please make sure you're subscribed to the channel. That's very important for us and for the growth of BioExplainer. Thank you. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed learning about Heinrich Hoffmann's controversial role in shaping Nazi propaganda. Here are 2 more videos you might enjoy. The first, Albert Speer, Hitler's Architect of Power, and the second, Joseph Goebbels, Master of Nazi Propaganda. See you in the next episode. We're almost at 1,000 subscribers. If you enjoy our videos, hit that subscribe button. It helps us grow and keep making more content for you.